The years following the American Revolution were challenging for the new nation, as it contended with the Articles of Confederation, Shays' Rebellion, federalism, the Alien and Sedition Acts and more. Shays' Rebellion was a series of violent attacks on courthouses and other government properties in Massachusetts that began in 1786 and led to a full-blown military confrontation in 1787. The rebels were mostly ex-Revolutionary War soldiers turned farmers who opposed state economic policies causing poverty and property foreclosures. The rebellion was named after Daniel Shays, a farmer and former soldier who fought at Bunker Hill and was one of several leaders of the insurrection. What caused Shays' Rebellion? The farmers who fought in the Revolutionary War had received little compensation, and by the 1780s many were struggling to make ends meet. Businesses in Boston and elsewhere demanded immediate payment for goods that farmers had previously bought on credit and often paid off through barter. There was no paper money in circulation and no gold or silver to be accessed by the farmers to settle these debts. At the same time, Massachusetts residents were expected to pay higher taxes than they had ever paid to the British in order to assure that Governor James Bowdoin's business associates would receive a good return on their investments. With no means to move their crops and make money to pay off debts and taxes, Boston authorities began to arrest the farmers and foreclose on their farms. The rebellion begins. Farmers first attempted peaceful means to settle their issues. In the August of 1786, farmers in western Massachusetts began to take direct action against debtors' courts. Committees of town leaders drafted a document of grievances and proposed reforms, some considered radical, for the legislature in Boston to enact. But other actions began to take place. In Northampton, Captain Joseph Hines led several hundred men to block judges from entering the courthouse. They were joined by a contingent from Amherst and several hundred more men from elsewhere. In Worcester, judges were blocked from holding court by crowds of hundreds of armed men. When the militia was called in, those men refused to answer, and many joined the crowd around the courthouse. Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays, for whom the rebellion was eventually named, was a farmer in Pelham and an ex-soldier who fought at Bunker Hill and other significant Revolution battles. Shays became involved with the insurgents sometime in the summer of 1786 and had taken part in the Northampton action. He was offered a leadership position in August but refused. Soon, however, Shays was leading a sizable group and the Eastern elite claimed he was the leader of the entire rebellion and potential dictator. But Shays was only one leader in the rebellion. In September, Shays led a group of 600 men to shut down the court in Springfield. Determined to use peaceful means, he negotiated with General William Shepherd for the court to open while allowing protesters to parade. The court eventually closed down when it couldn't find any jurors to serve. A concerned Henry Knox, an artillery commander during the Revolutionary War and the future first U.S. Secretary of War, wrote to George Washington in 1786 to warn him about the rebels. Shays' rebellion escalates. The insurgents found support in unexpected places. Chief Justice William Whiting of the Berkshire County Court was a wealthy conservative who publicly spoke out in favor of the rebellion, accusing the wealthy state legislatures of making money off the impoverished farmers and claiming the farmers were obligated to disrupt government in response. Legendary patriot Samuel Adams, however, called for the execution of the rebellious farmers. The Massachusetts legislature offered leniency and flexibility to those with tax burdens. Amnesty was also offered to the rebels if they disavowed the efforts to close the courts. The farmers were expected to take oaths of allegiance to the state government. How Shays' Rebellion Changed America. Get the story behind the uprising that propelled the Constitutional Convention to form a stronger national government. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't the future they envisioned when they cast off the British. 5 years after Yorktown, the promise of the American Revolution had been unfulfilled for thousands of farmers in western and central Massachusetts, many of whom had risked their lives serving in the state militia and Continental Army. They had received little pay or reimbursement for their military service, and now with the fledgling country mired in a severe economic recession, debt collectors began to seize their farms and possessions for unpaid debts and delinquent taxes. Men who fought for their freedom now languished behind bars in debtor prisons. Similar discontent smoldered from New Hampshire to South Carolina, but it raged in Massachusetts where the state government in Boston refused to hear the cries for relief coming from points west. The legislature not only rejected a measure to print more money, it imposed new taxes on people and property in early 1786. Although there was a severe cash shortage, state courts strictly enforced obligations to repay debts with paper money. Feeling aggrieved by their government, the Massachusetts farmers relied on a tactic that they had successfully employed against their British rulers in 1774. On August 29, 1786, more than 500 protesters, many of them Revolutionary War veterans accompanied by a fife and drum soundtrack, marched in military formation to the county court in Northampton. The farmers shut down the business of the court and prevented it from approving any further property seizures, debt collections, and foreclosures. Throughout the fall, the protests spread across the Massachusetts countryside as the disgruntled citizens, who called themselves regulators because they were attempting to regulate the function of government, shut down the courts in Great Barrington, Springfield, Worcester, Taunton, and even Concord, where some of the first shots of the American Revolution had been fired. Not only did local militias fail to defend the courts, some of their members even joined the insurrection. Many Massachusetts courts were forced to shutter for the remainder of their term in 1786. The uprising rattled some of America's foremost leaders, including George Washington. For God's sake, tell me, what is the cause of all these commotions? Do they proceed from licentiousness, British influence disseminated by the Tories, or real grievances which admit of redress? He asked former aide David Humphreys in an October 1786 letter. Commotions of this sort, like snowballs, gather strength as they roll, if there is no opposition in the way to divide and crumble them, he warned. The movement did indeed snowball as the snow began to fall from the skies in January 1787. Massachusetts Governor James Bowdoin decided action was needed to quell the insurrection. Bypassing his militia, Bowdoin raised private funds from Boston merchants to pay for a 1,200-man army that marched west under the command of former Continental Army General Benjamin Lincoln. With Lincoln's men on the move, the outgunned rebels attempted to capture the Federal weapons armory in Springfield with a force of 1,500 rebels under the direction of Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army who fought at Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Ticonderoga. Although the authorities had begun to refer to the uprising as Shays' Rebellion, the moniker vastly overstated the leadership role of the Massachusetts farmer, who was actually an unassuming character, according to author Ray Raphael in Founding Myths, Stories That Hide Our Patriotic Past. He in no way owned or even led the movement. In fact, he was not even active during the early stages of the uprising, Raphael writes. Shays was, however, one of the leaders of the force that marched on the Springfield Armory through 4 feet of snow and bitterly cold temperatures on January 25, 1787. There the regulators were met by a state militia force of 1,200 men guarding its gates. Men who fought side by side against the British just years earlier now confronted each other at gunpoint. When the rebels ignored 2 warning shots, the militia opened fire. Grapeshot and cannonballs tore through the front line of the regulators, leaving 4 dead and 20 wounded. The band of farmers, some of whom were carrying only sticks, fled immediately. A week later, on February 4, Lincoln's men ambushed Shays and his men at a camp in Petersham and crushed the main rebellion. Insurgent leaders including Shays fled north to Vermont, still an independent republic at the time. The legislature pardoned thousands of rank-and-file regulators as long as they paid a fine, surrendered their weapons and took an oath of loyalty to the states. 2 rebel leaders were hanged for treason, but Shays came out of hiding in Vermont after his eventual pardon in 1788. Perhaps judging the government's actions too harsh, Massachusetts voters tossed Bowdoin out of the governor's office in the spring of 1787. Lincoln lost his race for lieutenant governor. The newly elected legislature cut taxes and placed a moratorium on debts, helping to alleviate the economic crisis. Among those relieved at the quelling of Shays' rebellion was Washington. On the prospect of the happy termination of this insurrection, I sincerely congratulate you, he wrote to Secretary of War Henry Knox on February 25, 1787, hoping that good may result from the cloud of evils which threatened, not only the hemisphere of Massachusetts but by spreading its baneful influence, the tranquility of the Union. Shays' rebellion further underlined to Washington and other American leaders the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Although plans for a constitutional convention were already underway, the uprising in Massachusetts led to further calls for a stronger national government and influenced the ensuing debate in Philadelphia that led to the drafting of the U.S. Constitution in the summer of 1787. According to Edward J. Larson, author of The Return of George Washington, the rebellion haunted Washington and was perhaps an essential, final straw in pulling him out of retirement to serve as president of the Constitutional Convention. Regardless of their cause, the commotion sufficiently shocked Washington to set him on the road to Philadelphia, Larson writes. However, a bill was passed excusing sheriffs from responsibility if they killed any insurgents and declaring harsh punishments for rebels in custody. Soon after, the legislature suspended the writ of habeas corpus for a period of time. Another bill prescribed the death penalty for militiamen who took part in the protests. The situation continued to escalate. In December 1786, a militia assaulted a farmer and his family in Groton, arresting and crippling the farmer, which further fanned the flames of the insurrection. In January 1787, Governor Bowdoin hired his own army, privately funded by Boston businessmen. Some 4,400 men under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln were directed to put down the insurgency. Attack on Springfield Arsenal. Shays and other leaders made plans to raid the federal arsenal in Springfield to procure weapons. On the snow-covered morning of January 25, 1787, 1,200 men approached the arsenal. Some men had guns, while some carried clubs and pitchforks. General Shepherd predicted the assault and was waiting at the arsenal. Shepherd believed the insurgents planned to overthrow the government. Meanwhile, General Lincoln's troops marched from Worcester to Springfield to provide additional defense. Two other groups of insurgents traveled to join Shays. Another rebellion leader, Luke Day, who had ridden to Quebec with Benedict Arnold in 1775, would head from the north with 400 men. Eli Parsons would lead 600 men from the Berkshires. As they approached the arsenal, shots were fired at Shays and his men. The first two were warning shots over their heads, but further shots left 4 rebels dead and 20 wounded. The rest retreated to Chicopee, sending a message back to Shepherd demanding the dead for burial. Lincoln sent troops up the Connecticut River to prevent advances from Day's group. Shays and his men fled to Petersham. Lincoln followed, causing them to scatter. Shays and his wife fled to Vermont. Aftermath of Shays' Rebellion. Attempts to rekindle the rebellion from Vermont with Revolutionary War leader Ethan Allen failed. Allen quietly gave former rebels refuge in Vermont, but publicly disavowed them. The Boston legislature passed the Disqualification Act banning rebels from serving on juries, holding public office, voting, or working as schoolmasters, innkeepers, and liquor salesmen for 3 years. By the summer of 1787, many participants in the rebellion received pardons from newly elected Governor John Hancock. The new legislature placed a moratorium on debts and cut taxes, easing the economic burden the rebels were struggling to overcome. Some rebels were publicly paraded to the gallows before release. 2 were executed for burglary. Shays was pardoned the following year. He returned to Pelham briefly, then moved to Sparta, New York, where his legend made him a popular attraction for visitors. He died in 1825 and was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. Shays is memorialized by the Daniel Shays Highway in western Massachusetts, a section of U.S. Route 202 built in 1935 that runs through Pelham. Significance of Shays' Rebellion. At the time of Shays' Rebellion, the newly formed United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation, a document that many in the country felt was too weak to effectively manage the fledgling nation. The specter of Shays' Rebellion informed the debate over the framing of a new U.S. Constitution, providing fuel to Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists who advocated for a strong federal government and diminished states' rights. Nationalists used the rebellion to heighten paranoia, and George Washington was convinced enough by their arguments to come out of retirement and take part in the Constitutional Convention, where he was elected the first president of the United States. Shays' name was often mentioned in attacks by the Federalists against critics of the Constitution, who were referred to as Shaysites. When the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention began, many communities in Massachusetts that supported the rebellion sent delegates that had taken part in it. Of the 97 Shaysite towns sending delegates, only 7 voted in favor of the Constitution. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a series of 4 laws passed by the U.S. Congress in 1798 during the administration of President John Adams amid widespread fear that a foreign war against France was imminent. The laws, which remain controversial to this day, restricted the activities of foreign residents in the country and limited freedom of speech and of the press, particularly when it was critical of the president or the government. Most, but not all, of the laws have expired or been repealed over the years. Dueling political parties. The Federalist Party, which supported a strong central government, had largely dominated politics in the new nation before 1796 when John Adams won election as the second U.S. president. In opposition to the Federalists stood the Democratic-Republican Party, also known as Jeffersonians for their ideological leader, Thomas Jefferson. The Democratic-Republican Party, forerunner to today's Democratic Party, wanted to reserve more power to state governments and accused the Federalists of leaning more towards a monarchical style of government. The two parties also diverged dramatically over issues of foreign policy. In 1794, the Federalist administration of George Washington signed the Jay Treaty with Britain, greatly improving Anglo-American relations but angering the French, who were then at war with Britain. Soon after Adams took office, he sent a 3-member delegation to Paris to meet with the foreign minister, Charles Talleyrand. Instead, 3 French representatives, referred to in official U.S. documents as X, Y, and Z, demanded a $250,000 bribe, as well as a loan of $10 million, before talks could begin. After the Americans refused, word of the so-called XYZ affair spread at home, sparking outrage and calls for war against France. Why the Star-Spangled Banner is played at sporting events. The tradition began during a time of national sorrow. The instantly recognizable song is played before thousands of sporting events every year, but just how did the Star-Spangled Banner come to be a staple of sports in the first place? The answer, it turns out, has to do with World War I. Before it was the national anthem. Baseball fans in the late 19th century might have heard live military bands play the Star-Spangled Banner at a game every so often, but the song, which hadn't yet been designated as the national anthem, wasn't really a common occurrence at sporting events. That began to change on September 5, 1918, during Game 1 of the World Series between the Boston Red Sox and the Chicago Cubs. It was an era when the Red Sox still had Babe Ruth, and the phrase "the last time the Cubs won the World Series" wasn't yet a joke. In fact, the two teams had won 6 of the last 15 World Championship titles. Yet even though the event featured 2 teams at the top of their games, the crowd was somber that day, writes ESPN the magazine. Since entering the Great War a year and a half ago, more than 100,000 U.S. soldiers had died. And just a day before the game, a bomb had exploded in Chicago, the city in which the game was held, killing 4 people and injuring dozens more. In addition, the U.S. government had recently announced that it would begin drafting Major League Baseball players. All this sat heavy on the shoulders of both the players and the smaller-than-usual crowd of fans that day. But during the 7th-inning stretch, the U.S. Navy band began to play the Star-Spangled Banner, and something changed. As the song began, Red Sox infielder Fred Thomas, who was in the Navy and had been granted furlough to play in the World Series, immediately turned toward the American flag and gave it a military salute, according to the Chicago Tribune. Other players turned to the flag with hands over hearts, and the already standing crowd began to sing. At the song's conclusion, the previously quiet fans erupted in thunderous applause. At the time, the New York Times reported that it marked the highest point of the day's enthusiasm. The song would be played at each of the series' remaining games, to increasingly rapturous response. And patriotism played a part right from the start, as the Red Sox gave free tickets to wounded veterans and honored them during the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner before the start of the decisive Game 6. When did the tradition get popularized? Other baseball parks began to play the song on holidays and special occasions, and Red Sox owner Harry Frazee made it a regular part of Boston home games. The Star-Spangled Banner officially became the U.S. national anthem in 1931, and by the end of World War II, NFL Commissioner Elmer Layden ordered that it be played at every football game. The tradition quickly spread to other sports, aided by the introduction of large sound systems and post-war patriotism. The anthem's adoption also gave way to a new American pastime, almost as beloved as sports itself, complaining about people's behavior during the national anthem. By 1954, Baltimore Orioles general manager Arthur Ellers was already bemoaning fans he thought disrespected the anthem by talking and laughing during the song. Ellers briefly stopped playing the anthem altogether, before relenting to pressure. He reinstated it a month later.